I'm Jono Buchanan, and in this video we're going to look at creative spatial effects. Not special, although they will be special, but they're spatial too. Okay, now we know when we're working with all kinds of music, but potentially sort of particularly electronic dance music, that reverb and delay and spatial effects are a big part of the production pie, if you like. But it's really easy to kind of get into the habit of setting up sort of static reverbs and delays that sound nice and exciting but don't really do anything, and so after a while they become a bit boring. And so what we're going to do in this video is to look at various ways in which we can kind of just up our game as far as spatial effects are concerned. What I've done is to program an amazingly simple little track for a pluck sound and a bass sound and a drum loop, and it sounds like this. Okay, it's this main pluck sound that we're going to be focusing our attentions on, and you can see that what I've got on this track are two separate auxiliary buses. They're kind of the wrong way around, but that doesn't matter. We've got bus 2 here, which is providing us with some reverb, and we've got bus 1, which is providing us with delay. And of course, one of the things that we hear most commonly is the idea of introducing more or less of one of these effects as a track plays back. So we could, for example, select the reverb and simply increase the send amount. And we hear that kind of automation in tracks all of the time, and it sounds great. But again, let's see if we can move things on and make things a bit more interesting. Now, what we're going to do in order to do that, first of all, is we're going to turn one of these pluck performances into a piece of audio. What I want to be able to do is to reverse it, and I can't do that with MIDI. I need it to be audio. So I'm going to select one of them, and I'm going to hit Control, and I'm going to select Bounce in Place. And if for any reason that doesn't exist within the top 5 options that you have most recently used, come down here to Bounce and Join, and you will find Bounce in Place there, or we can learn the key command, which is Control and B. So any of those options will get you to Bounce in Place, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this Pluck Reverse, because that's what I'm going to do to it. Now then, I've always got the option to decide whether or not I want to leave the original MIDI performance, as in leave it alone, so nothing changes, mute it or delete it. I don't think you'll ever want to delete it. That would be a bit bold. I actually don't even want to mute it. I want this part to play alongside the original MIDI, the one that I'm about to create. So what I'm going to do is to hit leave. Now, because I'm going to include the audio tail in the file, what I'm actually going to end up with when I press OK is a file that's longer than the original, because I want to make sure that none of that gets cut off. So there we are, I've got my new audio file. So effectively now what I've got is exactly the same piece of information, but this time what's going to happen is that it's going to be audio rather than MIDI. It should sound exactly the same. Let's just solo it. Now you can see that what's happened is that in addition to just bouncing the MIDI, what it's also done is to duplicate the effects. So you're hearing reverb and delay, but they aren't baked into that file. If I was to sort of mute both of those effects, this should be dry. And sure enough, it is. Okay, so we've effectively got exactly the same piece of information, but now it's audio rather than MIDI. Okay, so why have I reversed it? Well, what I actually want to do is I want to have this part play backwards. And what I'm going to do is just make sure that it's exactly the same length as the original. And then I'm going to double click on this file. I'm going to make sure that the file option here is selected, and I'm going to hit Functions and Reverse. Now, if you aren't seeing this window, it's because you don't have the extended parameters switched on within Logic. So what you'll need to do is to come to the Logic Pro menu, come to Settings, and to make sure that you've got the advanced pane switched on and that you've enabled the complete feature set, which is here. So if you don't have this switched on, you won't see reverse. Okay, let's just jump back in here. So what I want to do is to come to File, I want to come to Functions, and I want to come to Reverse. And what that's going to do is to turn this all around. Okay, that's exactly what I want. So we've effectively got our sequence happening backwards, but of course the rhythm's the same, it's just that it's all happening backwards. Okay, now what I am going to do is to put the reverb back in, which I think is auxiliary 2. Sure enough, here it is. Now I'm going to turn up the send level to this, and now we've got our little wonky backwards effect triggering a reverb. and there's all that lovely reverb sort of wash happening at the end. Now what I want to do is to create a reversed reverb effect. So in other words, I want to have the reverb, just the reverb, captured within a file, having been triggered by the backwards version of this sound. And in order to do that, to make sure that the original dry signal isn't in the bounce as well, I just want the washy reverb, what I'm going to do is to solo the reverb channel here all by itself. And that means that the dry sound is still going to trigger this space, but it's going to only trigger the reverb. Now, another thing you need to be careful of is to make sure that your wet value is at 100% and that your dry value is at 0. If any dry signal gets in, this effect isn't quite as effective. Neat sentence. Okay, so there we are. We want to make sure that we've got only wet level and no dry. Okay, so having soloed it, I can press play, and this time we're only going to hear the reverb. Great, and I'm just checking that it's got silent by the time I've got to the end of my looped section. And the reason why that's important is because the next thing I'm going to do is to open up the mixer. I'm going to come to the bounce button in the stereo output, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture this as a new audio file. Now to do this, I'm going to do it in real time so we can hear it happening, but what I want to do is to add it to my project. I want this file that I'm about to bounce to become available to me within my Logic project. So I'm going to hit OK, and I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it reversed, or in fact, it's just too irresistible to call it Rev Reverb. That's what we'll do. We'll call it that. I'm going to hit bounce. Okay, and all that wash in bars 7 and 8 is going to be important. Okay, let's come out of solo mode. I'm going to turn the solos off and I'm going to mute this track. What I'm then going to do is to select a new audio track. I might want that part again, so I'm going to mute it for now, but I'm keeping it in my arrangement. And then, where is my new audio file? Well, I need to come over here into this main area where I've got my options to find the audio files that are in my project. And what I'm going to do is to select this new file, which will be at the bottom of the list, and I'm going to drag it into the arrange page. And this should just be my reversed reverb. Now, at the moment, remember, what I've got is a dry sound, which I turn round, and that's triggered the reverb. So effectively the reverb is backwards. But because I soloed the reverb, if I turn it around again, it's going to be the right way round, so the first notes of the sequence are going to be at the beginning again, but it's only going to be reverb. Okay, so if we open this file up one more time, and again we come to functions, and again we reverse it, what we should find is that we now have our sequence all washed out and only made of reverb, but playing the right way round. That's nice, isn't it? Okay, let's give it a bit of extra gain. Remember, the gain tool exists within Logic now. If I open up the toolbar, the gain tool's down here at the bottom, and what we can do is to make this file a little bit louder. I'm going to give it an extra 5 dB of gain, and then what I'm going to do is to jump back to where I started. Now, because I looped, remember the original file was here in bars 5 and 6, and what I've done is to reverse it, so effectively all of that information is now in bars 7 and 8. What I can then do is to just literally back this up 2 bars, and it should be more or less in time with the original. Now, if you need to do this by ear, then that's absolutely fine. Just, yeah, run the 2 sounds side by side until the 2 things match up, and hopefully we might be there just in one go. For me, that's starting a little bit early. Now, the thing that's interesting about that, of course, is we can be a bit creative here in terms of exactly where this falls. Do we want the reverb to kind of hang around after each note that triggered it, or do we want it to be out of the way before it starts? It's up to us. So I've moved it back 1 beat, and in fact, what I'm going to do is shave all of that bar off, and we'll just start from here. Yeah, I think I like that better. I'm going to just go back a quarter note, or in fact, let's have a look. I might just take this back a tiny bit more. Okay, I'm really happy with that. So I've taken that back just a little bit further, and now it feels like the alignment's really good. Let's put that in with everything else in the track. Okay, so that's working nicely, except that it's kind of dominating things a little bit. I want my original pluck sound to be the dominant sound, but I do like this reverse reverb effect. So one thing I might choose to do next would be to make sure that this reverb knows its place in the mix. In other words, whenever the original pluck sound is happening, I want it to duck and be quieter, and whenever it's not, it can be nice and loud. So what I'm going to do is to set up a compressor on this sound. I'm going to come down to the dynamics, come to compressor, and what I'm going to do is to open up the compression options. I've got a bunch of different compressors available. I'm going to select the vintage VCA compressor, and what I'm going to do is to feed the original instrument, the original pluck sound, in as a side chain input source. So in other words, now what's going to happen is the compressor is looking at that original sound, and its compression settings are going to respond to it rather than just to the dry sound that it's sitting on the track of. I'm going to drop the threshold, increase the ratio so we get a nice long, not long, but strong effect when it comes along. I'm going to turn off automatic gain so we're not getting a massive amount of extra volume. We'll tweak that to our tastes in just a moment. I'm going to run these two sounds together, and what we should find is that if I just run this section, the reverse reverb ducks really hard every time the pluck sound comes in. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to have this accompany every second sort of version of this. So I put this one in the wrong place, but now it should be in the right place. So effectively we get our reverse reverb going into this pluck, then a dry-ish version, and then the same thing again here. Okay, that's working nicely. One thing I might do as well would just be to thin this reversed reverb version out so it's got less bass in it. So it just comes in as a sort of brighter, more spatial effect, but again, taking less energy away from the original pluck. Good, I'm just going to turn it down a little bit too. Okay, so that's one thing we've done. So we've created a reverb effect, which is a bit more unique than simply just turning up the send level to the reverb. Okay, let's come back to our original reversed pluck. So this is just the dry version of this sound that we created before. I'm going to turn off the reverb and I'm going to turn on the delay instead. Now the delay, which is also added to just the dry pluck, it's on the mix at this point. What I'm going to do here is to again experiment with what happens when we bounce down a version of this pluck sound, which is just delay. So in other words, if I open up this auxiliary so that we're looking at just the delay and we solo that and turn off the solo for the original track, we're only hearing the delays, the wet delays if you like, so none of the original dry signal triggering it. And there we go, we're hearing those now. What I'm going to do once more is I'm going to bounce that down as an audio file. I need to come into the main mixer and I'm just going to hit the bounce button. And this time, when we bounce it, this is going to be delay, reverse delays. And again, I'm going to make sure that this is added to my project. When I hit bounce, we get those echoes. Okay, so that's good. Again, we can mute this. Let's come out of solo mode for a second and mute the original. And again, I'm going to need a new track to put these new delays on. So let's create a new audio track. Once again, return over here to our list of audio files. And again, I'm going to bring in these delays. Now, I don't need this one. I'm going to mute that. In fact, let's just turn off all the solos for a second, and let's just find this sound. Okay, so this is the sound we want to solo. And again, what I'm going to do is to open this up, and again, I'm going to reverse it. So effectively, the first note is back at the start of the sequence. Now, this won't sound quite so dramatic. It's only really going to be at the beginning of the file that we're going to notice any difference, because that's where the feedback echoes are, if you like. So think about it. We've got delays on an original file, and because that original file was the wrong way round, what we now get is kind of preemptive delays into the beginning of that file. And again, I think this could be louder. Again, I could use the gain tool. Now, the gain tool exists in two places. We already saw that it's here in the list, but there's also a little gain tab here. So if I want things to be louder, I can just boost gain there as well if I like. Now, I'm just wondering whether or not, if I was to just cut the front of this off, line it up with the original notes, the pluck sound, which I can see, well, at least I think I can see, I think it starts there, we could then use the section before it. Let's just check that that is right. I'll put it in with the metronome. So that is right, that's great. So what I'm going to do is to get rid of the sequence. Remember, the original pluck sound is going to play that. I'm interested in this bar beforehand, which is just this little ramping up set of echoes. Let's just hear that. And what we'll do is we'll loop it so that it's playing in every single bar all the way through the sequence of the track. So effectively, what it's going to do is just act as a little accompaniment to the main hook. Let's just put those two things in together and just see what it sounds like. Again, that's really nice. Let's take it on one more stage. Firstly, what we could do would be to feed this little delay audio file into a bit of the reverb. So we could send it just to a little bit of the chroma verb, just as a static effect. But what I also want to do is to get it moving in a couple of other ways. The first thing I'm going to do is to put a filter on it. Come down to the filter options, come to the auto filter, and what I'm going to do is just to put a little bit of high pass filtering on this sound. Let's see how much of it we need. And I'm going to introduce the LFO so that there's some movement coming into the way that the filter is going to behave. I'm going to clock that to 1 bar, and I think I'm going to set a ramp so that the ramp is going to come up in every single bar, so that this ramp shape is now controlling the cutoff frequency. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. Might just boost level a bit here. Okay, that's nice, with a little bit of resonance on it as well. And then what I'm going to do is to just make sure that I've also got a little bit of side-to-side movement as well, maybe using a bit of tremolo. So this is going to introduce some movement from left to right. I'm just going to make this not quite so smooth. We'll make it a little bit squarer, this movement, so the sound is just dancing from one side to another. Remember, this is all on these reverse delays. Okay, so they're both of our spatial effects side by side. Let's just get them sort of level matched to the track. So effectively what we've done here is to make effects out of audio. We've taken the original pluck sound, we've reversed it, and then what we've done is to apply spatial effects to those reverses, and as a result we've now got a kind of classic reverse reverb effect, but we've also got a little bit of reverse delay, which we're using as a kind of almost sequence type sound now that it's looped. And in fact, I need to just make a little adjustment to there because those little audio files are clicking, but that's easily fixed just with a couple of fade outs. So within this video, what we've seen is that we can actually take a part of our track, turn it into an audio file, and then use that as a trigger point for spatial effects. And we're just getting started. I could create a version of this that maybe got sampled so that I got a nice high tone out of one of these sounds that just sort of blossomed or sounded like a kind of extended bloom, a sort of kind of reverb. I could apply pitch shifting so I got an octave up or an octave down. I could use our delay designer trick to create a little sequence out of multi-tap delays. There are so many ways in which I could take the original audio file that's backwards and use it as a trigger point for something really unusual. So when it comes to creating spatial effects in your mix, don't just set up static auxiliaries and hope that reverb and delay will do the business all by themselves. Think creatively.